The day Adelaide Rourke's roof caved in was the same day Chester Shelby rode into Dusty Creek, Texas, and neither of them knew yet that their lives were about to become permanently tangled together in the way that only fate and stubbornness can manage. It was the autumn of 1882, and the Texas panhandle had been baking under a merciless sun all summer before the rains came in September with a vengeance that surprised everyone who had prayed for them. The adobe and timber structure that Adelaide had inherited from her late father had never been what anyone would call sturdy, but it had been home, and it had been hers, and those two facts had carried more weight than any engineer's assessment ever could. The northeastern corner of the roof came down on a Wednesday morning while she was out feeding her 3 remaining chickens, and when she turned around to see the cloud of dust rising from her own kitchen, she did not cry. Adelaide Rourke had not cried in 2 years, not since the fever took her father, and she did not intend to start now. She stood there in the yard, her dark auburn hair coming loose from its braid, her green eyes assessing the damage with the cool precision of a woman who had already survived more than most, and she said, quietly and to no one in particular, "Well, that is a problem." Chester Shelby arrived in Dusty Creek that same afternoon with a string of 3 horses. He was delivering to a rancher named Holt on the far side of town, a battered leather saddlebag, and the kind of easy grin that made people either trust him immediately or distrust him for exactly the same reason. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with sun-browned skin and dark eyes that had a quality of paying genuine attention to everything they looked at. He wore his hat pushed back the way a man does when he is not trying to impress anyone, and the silver on his belt buckle was tarnished in a way that suggested he had earned it honestly and then forgotten to polish it. He delivered the horses to Holt's ranch, collected his payment, and was riding back through the center of town toward the saloon that served actual meals when he passed the small property at the edge of Main Street and saw a woman standing on a ladder nailed against the side of her own house, attempting to drag a section of collapsed roof timber back into a position that physics simply would not support. Chester pulled his horse to a slow stop. The woman on the ladder had her jaw set in a way that reminded him of his late grandmother, which was to say, it reminded him of a woman who would sooner walk barefoot across hot coals than admit she needed help. She had a hammer in one hand and a length of rope in the other, and she was straining against a beam that had to weigh 3 times what she did. "Ma'am," Chester said, because he had been raised with manners even if he had spent the last decade in the company of cattle, "that beam is going to come down the other way and take you with it." Adelaide did not look at him. "Thank you for the observation," she said, her voice carrying the crisp, clipped quality of a woman whose family had come from somewhere east before they came here. "I have it under control." "You do not have it under control," he said, but he said it without any particular judgment, the way you say a thing that is simply and obviously true. She turned her head then, and the look she gave him was the kind that should have turned a lesser man around. "I did not ask for your opinion, Cowboy." "No," he agreed, climbing down from his horse anyway. "You did not." She watched him tie his horse to the fence post with a kind of outrage that had not yet decided what form to take. "What do you think you are doing?" "Stopping that beam from killing you," he said simply, coming to the base of the ladder. "Move over to the left a little and hold that rope. I will get underneath it." "I do not need your help." "No, I imagine you do not," Chester said, positioning himself below the compromised timber with both hands raised to catch it. "But the beam does not know that, and it is going to fall regardless of what either of us believes about your capabilities. So you can hold the rope or you can watch me try to catch 500 pounds of timber alone. Your choice." There was a pause. The beam shifted visibly, sending a small cascade of broken adobe dust down into the yard. Adelaide grabbed the rope. They worked together for the better part of an hour, Chester doing the heavy lifting and Adelaide directing him with the confident authority of a woman who had studied every inch of this structure, and knew exactly what needed to happen even if she could not do all of it herself. She was not a woman who wasted words, but the words she did use were precise, and Chester found himself respecting that almost as much as the fact that she never once said thank you in a way that sounded like she was diminishing herself. She said it once, crisply, when the beam was secured and the immediate danger was past, and she said it the way you acknowledge a fact rather than beg a favor. "That will hold for now," she said, climbing down from the ladder and brushing mortar dust from her dark skirt. "I appreciate the assistance." "Chester Shelby," he said, offering his hand. She looked at it, then at him, then took it briefly. "Adelaide Rourke." "You live here alone, Miss Rourke?" Her chin came up in that way again. "I do. My father passed 2 years ago. The property is mine." "And the rest of the roof?" She looked up at the structure with the expression of a general assessing a battlefield she knows she is losing. "It will require repair," she said. Chester looked up at it too. The damage was considerably more extensive than what they had just addressed. The northeastern corner was the most obvious collapse, but the ridge line was bowing in 2 places, and the western section had a sag that suggested the supporting structure beneath had rotted through. It was not a quick repair. It was not a cheap one either. "I could take a look at the underlying supports tomorrow," he said, "if you are staying in town." "I am always in town," she said, picking up her tools. "This is my home." "I meant me," he said. "I have no pressing business for a few days. I could look." She turned and faced him fully then, and he saw something move behind her eyes that she immediately contained. It was the thing that lives in proud people when they are being offered something they desperately need but cannot stand to accept. It was a complicated emotion, and he recognized it because he had worn it himself once, a long time ago in different circumstances. "I cannot pay you," she said, and she said it with the directness of someone who will not be embarrassed by the truth but will not pretend it away either. "I know," he said easily. "I did not ask to be paid." The chin came up again. "I do not accept charity, Mr. Shelby." "Good," he said, turning back to his horse. "I was not offering any." He untied the reins and swung up into the saddle, and he looked down at her with that easy, unhurried expression. "I will be back tomorrow morning, early." She watched him ride away with the expression of a woman who was not entirely sure what had just happened, which was unusual for Adelaide Rourke, who was accustomed to being entirely sure about most things. He came back the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She was already up. He had suspected she would be. She was in the yard with coffee in a tin cup, and she poured him one without being asked, which he took as a positive sign. She had also, he noticed, prepared a list. The list was written on a page torn from what appeared to be a ledger book, in a hand so neat it looked almost printed, and it itemized every structural failure she had identified in the roof, noted the probable cause of each, and included her best estimation of the materials required to address them. He stood there reading it while his coffee cooled, and when he looked up she was watching him with that assessing green gaze. "This is thorough," he said. "I was a school teacher," she said. "Before my father took ill and I had to come home to care for him, I am accustomed to making assessments. You could go back to teaching. The school board here has a teacher," she said. "Have this property." She said it the way you say something you have already settled in yourself. "My father built this house in 1871. It was the first house on this street. I intend to keep it standing." Chester drank his coffee and looked at the house and thought about the list in his hand and made several calculations. "I need to get up on the roof today and check the ridge," he said, "and I need to see what is underneath that western sag. I have a ladder." "I saw that," he said. "It is a good ladder." She looked at him as if trying to determine whether he was being sarcastic. He was not. It was, in fact, a very solid ladder, better maintained than anything else on the property, which told him something about her priorities. She maintained what she needed to get the work done. He spent the morning on the roof, and the news was not good, but it was also not as bad as it could have been. The northeastern collapse was contained. The ridge needed significant reinforcement but had not yet failed completely. The western sag was the worst of it because the main support beam had developed a deep crack from water infiltration over years, and it needed to be replaced before winter, which in the Texas panhandle could arrive with very little warning and considerable force. He came down off the roof mid-morning and found Adelaide in the yard, not idle, but sorting through a pile of salvageable lumber she had apparently pulled from somewhere on the property. She was measuring pieces with a string and discarding the ones too warped or rotten to use. He watched her for a moment before she noticed him. "The main western support needs replacing," he said. "The rest I can work with. How much lumber do you have?" she told him. It was not enough, but it was more than he had expected. She had been collecting what she could, which meant she had already been planning this repair herself and simply could not complete it alone. The realization settled something in him. "There is a mill in Amarillo," he said. "I need to go there anyway in a week or so. I could bring back the timber you need and add it to the load." Adelaide straightened up from the lumber pile and looked at him with that expression she had, the one that was simultaneously grateful and suspicious. "At what cost?" "The mill has owed me a favor since last spring," he said, which was the truth, though not the complete truth. The mill man owed him exactly $30 in cash, not lumber, but Chester had already decided that $30 would buy the timber she needed, and he was not going to complicate the arrangement by explaining the distinction. "I do not want favors passed on to me like second-hand shoes," she said. "Then think of it as efficient use of an existing arrangement," he said. "The favor gets used either way. You might as well benefit from it." She studied him for a long moment. He had already learned to hold still under that gaze and let her reach her own conclusions, because pushing Adelaide Rourke in any direction she was not ready to go would simply result in her going the opposite way out of principle. "Fine," she said at last, "but I will feed you while you are working here. 3 meals a day, that is my contribution." "That is more than fair," he said, and meant it, because he had been surviving on saloon meals and camp cooking for 2 months, and the smell coming from her kitchen that morning had already told him she was a serious cook. He was not wrong. She made biscuits that evening that were better than any he had eaten since leaving his mother's house in Tennessee 12 years ago, and she served them with a rabbit stew that she explained, without embarrassment, was made from a rabbit she had shot herself that morning. She said this the way a woman says such things when she wants to be sure you understand she is capable of providing for herself, and Chester received the information in the spirit it was intended, and told her the stew was the best he had eaten since last Christmas, which was also true. They ate at her small table near the window, the golden evening light coming through the dusty glass, and they talked the way strangers do when they are trying to understand each other. She asked him where he had come from, and he told her Tennessee, then cattle work in Kansas, then horse trading that had brought him down through the Oklahoma Territory and into Texas. She asked whether he had family, and he said a brother in Kansas City and his parents were both gone. She did not offer unnecessary sympathy, which he appreciated, just nodded and moved on. He asked her about her mother, and she said her mother had died when she was 11, on the journey west from Georgia from typhoid. She said it without visible grief, but with the quality of someone who has had a long time to keep that sorrow in a place where it does not interfere with daily life. She had come west with her father and an uncle who had eventually gone further, to New Mexico, and they had not heard from him in 4 years, and had given up expecting to. "You have been on your own a long time," Chester said. "I have been capable a long time," she corrected without heat. "There is a distinction." He smiled at that, and it was a real smile, not the easy social grin he wore on ordinary occasions. "There is," he agreed. Over the days that followed, a rhythm developed between them that felt both natural and new, the way a good song does when you hear it for the first time and cannot believe you have never heard it before. Chester worked on the roof in the mornings, starting at first light, and Adelaide worked her garden and fed her chickens and managed the accounts for 3 businesses on Main Street, which she did with a neat ledger book and a sharp pen, sitting at her kitchen table in the afternoons. She had made herself indispensable to the general store owner, the farrier, and the woman who ran the boarding house, and none of them quite knew how central she had become to their financial record-keeping, which suited her perfectly. Chester discovered this on the third day when he came down off the roof for midday water and found her deep in someone else's accounts with the focused expression of a woman who could work in perfect silence for hours. He brought her a glass of water without interrupting her and set it on the corner of the table and went back outside. And when she came out an hour later, she looked at the glass and then at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "You do not interrupt," she said. "A person in the middle of numbers should not be interrupted," he said. "My mother kept the books for my father's mill. I learned that early." Something softened very slightly around her eyes. "She sounds like a sensible woman." "She was the most sensible person I have ever known," he said, "right up until now." Adelaide looked at him for a moment and then looked away, and there was color in her face that had nothing to do with the heat. She said nothing else about it, but she brought him a piece of cornbread when she went back inside, and she set it next to him without making a ceremony of it, and Chester ate it and said nothing about the color that had been in her face, because he understood that Adelaide Rourke received things better when they were not called attention to. That principle became the foundational logic of everything that followed. By the end of the first week, he had reinforced the ridge and repaired the northeastern corner properly. Using salvaged timber from her pile supplemented with pieces, he purchased himself at the local yard, and listed in his mental accounting not as money spent on her behalf, but as materials required to complete a job, which was also true, since he had decided to complete the job, and the job required the materials. He mentioned this to no one and listed nothing. On the Friday of that week, a situation arose in Dusty Creek that tested Adelaide's composure more severely than any structural failure had. The man who owned the saloon, a heavy-jowled individual named Bart Prescott who had come up from Galveston 8 years ago and had been making himself unpleasant ever since, stopped Adelaide on the boardwalk outside the general store and told her in a loud voice that he had heard she was having financial troubles, and that he would be willing to offer her a position at the saloon in an unspecified capacity that his tone made entirely specific, if she was interested in solving those troubles. Adelaide was 26 years old, and she had heard enough of the world to know exactly what he meant, and exactly what he expected her to do with the offer, which was to be grateful and considerate. She was not grateful. She looked at Bart Prescott with the full force of her green eyes and said, clearly enough to be heard by everyone on the boardwalk, "Thank you, Mr. Prescott. I would sooner eat the wood rot from my own roof, and I expect the nutrition would be comparable to the quality of your establishment." There was a moment of absolute silence on that boardwalk, and then old Mrs. Henley from the boarding house made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, and Prescott's face went through several unpleasant colors before he turned and walked away. Chester had not been present for this exchange, but he heard about it within 2 hours from 3 separate sources, because Dusty Creek was a small town and Adelaide Rourke had just become the talk of it. He heard it, and he felt something hot move through his chest that was partly admiration and partly something more protective that he did not yet have a name for. He also made a note about Bart Prescott that he filed away for later reference. When he arrived at Adelaide's house that evening for supper, she did not mention it, so he did not mention it either. She had made venison stew, the venison contributed by the farrier named Gus, who had apparently been given a hindquarter by a hunting party and had no idea what to do with it, and she had accepted it from Gus by agreeing to spend an extra afternoon organizing his invoices. This was Adelaide's system, and it worked precisely because it was always an exchange, always balanced, never a gift. Chester understood the system by now. He did not compliment it or comment on it. He simply worked within it. "I heard you put Bart Prescott in his place today," he he said eventually, when they had been sitting in comfortable silence long enough that the comment would not feel like he had been waiting to say it. She looked at him across the table. He made an offensive suggestion. I gathered. I responded to it. You did, he agreed, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. It does not trouble you, she said, meaning the town's opinion of a woman who spoke that bluntly to a saloon owner. It impresses me, he said simply, considerably. She looked at him for a long moment, and this time she did not look away as quickly. You are a strange man, Chester Shelby, she said. I have been told that before, he agreed pleasantly. By whom? My brother mostly. Also several cattle buyers who were hoping I would take a lower price. She laughed at that, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh. A real one, not the polite kind, and it was lower than he expected, and genuine, and it did something to the space behind his sternum that he thought about for a long time after he walked back to his room at the boarding house that night. He lay on his bunk listening to the sounds of the saloon down the street, which were the usual Friday night sounds of a frontier town in 1882, boisterous and occasionally punctuated by the kind of raised voices that sometimes developed into more physical arguments, and he thought about Adelaide Rourke's laugh and her ledger books, and the way she had looked at that glass of water he had brought her without interrupting her work, like it was something she had not known she needed until it appeared. He thought about a great many things, and he arrived at several conclusions, the most significant of which was that he was not going to leave Dusty Creek when the roof was done. This was not something he had been planning. He had been a man without fixed plans for 12 years, moving with work and season and inclination, which had suited him well enough and which he had not questioned. Now he was questioning it, which surprised him, though perhaps it should not have, given everything. He wrote to his brother James in Kansas City that night by the light of the oil lamp, a longer letter than usual, which told James more than the words themselves said. The following week was the one in which Chester went to Amarillo for the timber, and this was the week in which Adelaide Rourke discovered that pride, when it is not careful, becomes a cage built from the same materials as dignity but shaped entirely differently. She discovered it on the Tuesday he was away. With Chester in Amarillo, the house was quiet in a way it had not been for 2 weeks, and Adelaide found herself working through her afternoon accounts with a distracted quality she did not appreciate. She set down her pen twice without having written anything, and stood at the window twice without knowing why she had gone there. The third time she stood at the window, she acknowledged to herself that she was looking to see if his horse was coming down the road, and then she went back to her desk and picked up her pen with a firmness that was slightly excessive for the action of picking up a pen. On Wednesday, she found 3 of her hens were sick, a respiratory ailment that spread quickly in confined birds, and 2 of them were dead by Thursday morning. She could not afford to lose her laying hens. Each egg was part of a carefully balanced economy that she maintained with the same precision she applied to everyone else's accounts. She stood in the yard looking at the dead birds and felt the weight of the situation settle onto her shoulders, and she was just deciding that she would walk to the feed store and ask Old Hatch whether there was something to be done for the remaining bird when she heard a wagon coming down the road. Chester pulled the wagon up to her fence and climbed down, and he looked at the scene in the yard, the 2 dead birds, the surviving hen in the small coop, Adelaide's expression, and he said nothing for a moment. He had brought the timber, which was neatly stacked in the wagon bed, and he had also, she noticed, brought something in a wooden crate covered with burlap. I am sorry about the hens, he said. It happens, she said. I will manage. He nodded. He unloaded the timber first, stacking it neatly against the side of the house in the order of use. Then he came back to the wagon and lifted down the crate and set it on the ground and pulled the burlap back to reveal 6 young hens, brown-feathered, healthy, bright-eyed. Adelaide looked at the hens and then at Chester, and the expression on her face was complicated in ways she was working hard to contain. I cannot accept those, she said. You are not accepting them, Chester said. They are payment. She looked at him. Payment for what? For the meals, he said, with the easy reasonableness of a man who had spent several days in Amarillo thinking about exactly how to phrase this. I have been eating here for 2 weeks. A man cannot eat 3 meals a day without accounting for it. 6 pullets is what I calculated to be a fair exchange for 14 days of boarding. Adelaide looked at the hens. She looked at Chester. She knew, with the precise mathematical mind that made her so good at other people's accounts, that 6 pullets were worth considerably more than 2 weeks of her cooking. But she also knew that he had thought about this carefully enough to have a specific number ready, and that the number was close enough to plausible that she could accept it without feeling like she was accepting charity, and she understood that he had done this deliberately. The realization should have made her angry. It did not. It made her feel something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it. She felt cared for, not pitied, not managed, cared for. There was a difference that she had almost forgotten existed. 6 seems generous, she said. I eat a lot, he said. She looked at him for a long moment with those green eyes, and then she looked at the hens. They are a good breed, she said. They are Plymouth Rocks, he said. Good layers, hardy. The man at the feed store in Amarillo said they do well in this climate. You asked specifically. I wanted to make sure you got your money's worth, he said. There was a pause that held a great deal in it. All right, she said. Help me get them settled. They put the new hens in with the surviving original, and Adelaide treated all 7 of them with a careful hand and watchful eyes, and by the time they came back inside for supper the kitchen was warm from the stove and the lamp light was golden, and something between them had shifted in a way that neither of them commented on but both of them felt. You stayed longer in Amarillo than you needed to, she said, putting plates on the table. I had errands, he said. Buying hens. Among others, he said. She sat down across from him and looked at him with a directness that he had come to recognize as Adelaide at her most honest. Why are you still here, Chester? He met her eyes. Because the roof is not done yet. That is the practical reason, she said. I am asking for the real one. He was quiet for a moment, not because he did not know the answer, but because he wanted to say it correctly. Because this is the first place I have been in 12 years where I thought about staying, he said, and I am trying to understand whether that is the place or the person. Adelaide held his gaze. The lamplight moved between them like a slow river. And have you reached a conclusion? Getting close, he said quietly. She looked down at her plate and there was color in her face again, and this time she did not look away quickly so much as she looked away carefully, which was a different thing entirely. She picked up her fork. The roof should be done by next week, she said. If the weather holds, he agreed. It did not hold, but not in the way they feared. On Saturday morning, 3 days after Chester had returned from Amarillo, the sky turned the particular shade of yellow-green that old-timers in the panhandle recognized and told you, with great authority, meant a storm that would make you regret all your life choices. Chester was on the roof when he saw it and came down immediately. We need to get everything that can be moved inside, he said. Adelaide had already seen the sky. She was in the garden pulling up her remaining squash with the efficiency of someone who had seen this sky before and knew exactly what it meant. The lumber, she said. I am on it, he said. You get the chickens in. What followed was 40 minutes of organized, efficient, wordless collaboration that impressed Chester deeply, because Adelaide Rourke did not panic, did not hesitate, did not once defer to him out of uncertainty. She knew what needed to be done and she did it, and she trusted him to do his part without needing to oversee it. This was a quality he had rarely encountered in anyone, man or woman. They got inside with 10 minutes to spare before the storm hit, and it was a significant storm, a late-season thunder boomer that rattled the newly reinforced roof with everything it had. They sat in her kitchen and listened to it, drinking coffee, and it was the first time Chester had been inside with her in a genuinely confined way, the storm making the small kitchen smaller, the lamplight closer. She is holding, Adelaide said, looking at the ceiling. The ridge reinforcement is doing what it should, he said. You knew what you were doing. I have repaired a few roofs, he said. Have you built any? He looked at her. A few, why? She turned her coffee cup in her hands. She looked at the table. This was, he recognized, Adelaide Rourke approaching something sideways because approaching it directly was more vulnerability than she was yet prepared to offer. He waited. "This house needs more than a roof repair eventually," she said. "The foundation on the eastern side is not level. The window frames on the south wall have begun to separate from the adobe. The kitchen is very small. My father always meant to add to it, but—" She stopped. The storm rattled the roof. "He ran out of time," Chester said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "A foundation can be leveled with the right equipment. The window frames are a matter of resetting them with new mortar and enough patience. The kitchen," he looked around the room. "There is room on that eastern side to put a proper addition. Another 12 feet would make a significant difference." She looked at him. "I was not asking you to plan renovations." "I know," he said. "I was thinking out loud." She looked at him a moment longer. "You are very comfortable here," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "In my kitchen." "In your kitchen," he agreed. "In this town in general." The storm moved through them like a weather system carrying things they had not said yet, rearranging the atmosphere between them in the way that storms do to landscapes. When it passed, the evening was washed clean and the air was sharp and cool, and Chester stood in the yard looking at the roof while Adelaide stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. "It held," he said eventually. "It held," she agreed. He looked at the house. He looked at her. Adelaide. She turned to look at him, and in the clean evening light after the storm he thought she was the most striking woman he had ever seen, not in a soft or conventional way, but in the way of something that has been tested by real conditions and has not softened but has become more itself. "I want to stay," he said, "not to work on the house, in the town, in general proximity to you." She looked at him for a long time. "You are a traveling man," she said. "I have been," he said. "I am choosing not to be." "Why?" "Because I find I am not interested in any road that does not bring me back to this address," he said. Adelaide looked at the house. She looked at the yard. She looked at the hens settling in their coop for the evening, the new ones among the old one, everyone accounted for. She looked at Chester Shelby and thought about the water glass he had left without interrupting her, and the hens he had called payment, and the way he had worked beside her in the storm without needing to take charge of anything, and the fact that he had spent 2 weeks in her company without once making her feel like a problem to be solved. "You could stay," she said at last, "if you found work in the area." "There is work," he said. "Holt has been asking me about running a section of his remuda, and I have thought about setting up a proper horse trading operation here. There is no one in this town doing that seriously, and the demand is considerable." She looked at him with that assessing expression. "You have been thinking about this for a while." "A while," he agreed. "How long exactly?" He thought about it honestly. "Since about the 4th day," he said. Something moved in her eyes that was as close to tenderness as he had yet seen from her. "That was very fast," she said. "I am a decisive man," he said. "When the situation warrants it." She was quiet. Then very quietly, "You may stay, Chester, if it is what you want." "It is entirely what I want," he said. The roof was finished by the following Thursday, and it was the best roof in Dusty Creek, not because Chester was showing off but because he was constitutionally unable to do a thing badly once he had decided to do it. He replaced not only the failed sections but reinforced the entire structure, laying new cedar shingles on the repaired framework, and the result was a roof that would stand for 20 years if it was cared for, which it would be, because Adelaide Rourke cared for the things that were hers. On the day the last shingle went down, Adelaide came outside and looked up at it and then at Chester, who was climbing down the ladder with the expression of a man who has finished a thing properly. She handed him a cup of coffee and they stood in the yard together looking at the house. "It looks different," she said. "It looks like itself," he said. "But sound." She nodded slowly. "My father would be pleased," she said. The statement came quietly, without sentimentality, but with the particular weight of a woman who carried her father's memory as carefully as she carried everything else. Chester looked at her profile. "He built a good house," he said, "and he raised a woman who kept it." She did not respond for a moment. Then she said, "Dinner tonight is a proper one. You have earned it." He had taken a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Henley, who was a sharp-eyed woman of 60 who had observed everything going on at the Rourke property with the comprehensive attention she brought to all neighborhood events, and who had expressed her opinion to Adelaide during a Tuesday afternoon accounts session by saying simply, "He seems like a man of substance," in a tone that was neither gossip nor criticism, but something between a fact and a blessing. Adelaide had recorded a column of numbers without looking up. "He is a competent carpenter," she said. "Among other things, Mrs. Henley had said, and changed the subject with the serene satisfaction of someone who has made the point they came to make. Chester did eat dinner that night, a proper one as promised, roasted chicken from a bird Adelaide had bought at the market, which was a significant expenditure and one he recognized as such. And he said nothing about it, only ate with appreciation, and talked about the horse trading operation he was planning and the conversation he had with Holt about a seasonal contract and the letter he had received from his brother James, who was coming south in the spring on business and wanted to meet up. "Your brother comes to Texas," Adelaide said. "He has clients in San Antonio," Chester said. "He is a lawyer." She looked interested in spite of herself. "A lawyer. A surprisingly good one, given that he was a complete idiot until he was about 22, Chester said, and she laughed again, that real low laugh. In the weeks that followed, Chester established himself in Dusty Creek with the same methodical approach he brought to everything else. He negotiated the contract with Holt, who was a practical man and recognized a skilled horseman when he saw one. He rented a small corral on the south end of town from a man named Peabody who had no use for it, and charged a reasonable amount, and he began building the kind of reputation that horse traders build through honest dealing and consistent quality, which was the only kind that lasted. He also, with a care and ingenuity that he never called attention to, continued to find ways to improve Adelaide's situation without calling it improvement. When the general store owner, whose name was Clancy, mentioned in Chester's presence that he needed someone to help manage his accounts for a very significant expansion he was planning, Chester said easily, "You should talk to Adelaide Rourke. She does Gus's books and the boarding house. She is the best person in the county at that kind of work." He said it not as a recommendation but as a straightforward fact, which it was, and Clancy went to see Adelaide that same week. Adelaide got the Clancy account, which paid 3 times what any of her other accounts paid, and which gave her the financial stability she had been working toward with grinding patience for 2 years. She did not know that Chester had said anything to Clancy. She assumed Clancy had heard through the natural channels of a small town, which was also partly true. She put the new income in her ledger with the satisfied neatness of a woman who has reached a goal by her own efforts, which was also what she had done, because the quality that got her the account was entirely her own. Chester did not tell her. He saw no reason to complicate a good outcome. He also, without mentioning it, spoke to the school board chairman at a town meeting about the fact that the school had 14 children in it and 1 teacher, and was open only 4 days a week due to the limitations of a single instructor. He mentioned Adelaide's background in teaching and her current availability in the afternoons. He said this the way you say a thing that is simply useful information, not the way you advocate for someone, though he was advocating for someone. The school board chairman, whose name was Whitfield, looked thoughtful. 3 weeks later, Whitfield went to see Adelaide about a half-time teaching position for the afternoon sessions, which would give her an income she could be proud of from work she was genuinely suited for. Adelaide accepted the position with a composure that suggested she did not know it had anything to do with Chester, and she was right that it did not have everything to do with Chester, because she had built the reputation that made her name worth Whitfield's attention. Chester had simply made sure the attention was directed. It was around this time, in late October 1882, that Chester began to understand that the feeling in his chest when he thought about Adelaide Rourke was not the novelty of a new place or the warmth of proximity, but something considerably more specific and considerably more permanent. He understood it in the way you understand something that has been true for a while before you find the precise language for it. He was in love with her. He had probably been in love with her since somewhere around day 4, which was when he had said so, though he had not used that particular word at the time. What he did not know was how she felt, or rather, he knew some of it and not enough of it, and the gap between what he knew and what he needed to know was wide enough to require careful navigation. Adelaide Rourke was not a woman you pressed. He understood that. She made decisions in her own time and by her own process, and the fastest way to push her away was to move faster than she was ready to move. He accepted this constraint without resentment because he understood where it came from. A woman who had been managing alone since she was 24, who had learned to depend on nothing and no one because depending on things was how you got hurt when they were taken from you, did not simply open the door and wave you in because you had fixed her roof and brought her hens. He was patient. He was present. He continued to eat dinner at her table 3 or 4 evenings a week, and they talked about everything and nothing with the comfortable range of 2 people who have found the right frequency. And he made her laugh more often than he made her think about difficulty. And he watched her slowly, carefully, like a person who has been in the cold a long time and does not trust warmth all at once, begin to trust it in small increments. In November, 2 things happened that changed the shape of things considerably. The first was that Bart Prescott, perhaps deciding that public humiliation was insufficient provocation, went to see Clancy and told him a collection of unflattering and entirely fabricated stories about Adelaide's professional conduct, presumably hoping that Clancy would withdraw the account and Adelaide would find herself in difficulty. Clancy, who was a decent man and who had been working with Adelaide's meticulous bookkeeping for 2 months and trusted it absolutely, did not believe a word of it. He mentioned the visit to Adelaide himself, directly and without softening it, because he felt she should know. Adelaide received the information in the quiet, contained way she received most bad news, and she thanked Clancy. And then she went home and sat at her kitchen table for a while with her ledger book closed in front of her, which was the closest she came to doing nothing. Chester came that evening and knew immediately that something was wrong, not because she said so, but because she had cooked nothing and the table was bare, and she was sitting in the chair by the window with a quality of stillness that was different from her usual focused calm. "What happened?" he said, not a question. She told him. She told it plainly, without embellishment or self-pity, and when she finished she said, "I do not understand what he hopes to gain." "He hopes to make you small enough that you need what he is offering," Chester said. He said it quietly and without heat, though he felt considerable heat internally. "It is what men like that do when they cannot stand being answered back." She looked at him. "He has done this to other women here." "I know," Chester said. "I have heard some of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I can handle Prescott," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I am not suggesting otherwise." He paused. "I would like to talk to him." "Chester, not the way you are thinking," he said. "I'm not going to threaten him or make a scene. I'm going to tell him that I am aware of what he said to Clancy and that I am paying attention and that the consequences of further interference will be significant, calmly, privately, in a way that gives him the opportunity to make the sensible choice." She looked at him for a long time. "Why?" she said. "Because he should know that you are not alone," Chester said. He said it simply, without decoration, and looked at her directly. The silence that followed was the kind that contains a great deal more than silence. Adelaide looked at Chester Shelby sitting across from her in the lamplight, and she thought about the word alone and what it meant to not be it and what it would mean to allow herself to not be it, and she felt the door inside her open another inch and then another. "You should be careful," she said quietly. "I am always careful," he said. "You are sometimes reckless," she said. He smiled. "Only with things that matter." She looked at him for one more moment, and then she stood up and went to the stove and began to make supper, and it was very late before Chester walked back to the boarding house that night. He spoke to Prescott the next morning. He did it quietly, in the space between the saloon's front door and the street, with a tone that was entirely level and a manner that was entirely clear. He told Prescott that he had made a mistake and that the intelligent course of action was to not make another one, and that he would be watching. Prescott was a bully, which meant he understood the specific language of someone who was not going to be deterred, and he did not respond aggressively, only watched Chester walk away with an expression that contained several calculations. He did not approach Clancy or anyone else on the subject of Adelaide Rourke after that. The second thing that happened in November was that Chester's brother James wrote to say he had business in Amarillo in December, and proposed to come down to Dusty Creek for a visit, which had been his plan all along but which he now framed as a detour from more significant business, which was not entirely untrue, but was also partly a function of the letters Chester had been sending, which had grown progressively more interesting to James from a personal rather than professional standpoint. Chester told Adelaide about the visit on a Friday evening, and she looked mildly alarmed in a way she immediately contained. "Your brother is coming here," she said. "For a few days," Chester said. "He will stay at Mrs. Henley's." "I see," Adelaide said. She looked at her coffee. "That will be nice for you." Chester watched her. "I thought perhaps one evening you might join us for supper at the restaurant, if you were free." She looked up. The restaurant. There was one proper restaurant in Dusty Creek, run by a woman named Maria who cooked Mexican and American food with equal authority and had somehow created an establishment that felt genuinely civilized despite its frontier address. Chester and Adelaide had never eaten there together. They ate at her kitchen table, which was a different kind of thing entirely. "You do not need to," Chester said, "but I would like you to. I would like him to meet you." The color was in Adelaide's face again. She looked at her coffee for a long time. "Why?" she said, and the question was quieter than usual, carrying more. "Because you are the most important person in my life in this town," Chester said, "and he is my brother, and those two facts seem relevant to each other." Adelaide was very still. Then she said very quietly, "Yes, Chester, I will come." James Shelby arrived on a cold December afternoon when the sky was the color of pewter and the wind had teeth. And he turned out to be so similar to his brother in some ways and so different in others that Adelaide found herself immediately reassured and immediately curious in equal measure. He was 2 years older than Chester, with the same dark eyes but a more polished quality, the lawyer's training evident in the way he listened and chose his words, and he shook Adelaide's hand when Chester introduced them on the street and said, "I have heard a great deal about you, Miss Rourke," with a smile that contained genuine warmth. "That must have been an interesting collection of things," Adelaide said. "Very complimentary," James said. "Mostly about your accounting and your roofing opinions, but there was also a great deal about your cooking." Chester looked briefly at the middle distance. "He flatters himself," Adelaide said, but she was smiling. They had supper at Maria's restaurant that Saturday evening, a table by the window, the three of them, and it was the kind of evening that exists in memory as larger than its actual hours because of the quality of what happened in it. James was good company, quick and funny and genuinely interested in Adelaide without being intrusive, and he treated her with the easy respect of a man who had been well informed about who she was. He and Chester fell into the comfortable shorthand of brothers, finishing each other's stories and arguing about the same events with different versions, and Adelaide found herself laughing more than she expected and noticing, through the warm haze of a good dinner and good wine, which Maria had obtained from a supplier in San Antonio and which was remarkably good, that Chester watched her when she laughed, not in a performative way, in the way of a man who finds the sight of a specific person genuinely pleasing and is not entirely in control of the fact that his eyes go there. She filed that observation carefully. After supper, when James had gone back to Mrs. Henley's and Chester was walking Adelaide back to her house through the cold December street, they walked in the comfortable quiet they had developed, their breath making small clouds in the air, and Adelaide said, "Your brother is very kind." "He is," Chester agreed. "He loves you very much." "He does, though he would deny it if asked directly," Chester said. "He is a lawyer, they hedge everything." She laughed softly. They had reached her gate, and the lamplight was on inside the house because she had left it burning, and the house looked warm and sound under the new roof, the stars very bright above it in the cold, clear sky. She turned to look at Chester. He was very close, the way the cold made people stand closer than they might in warmer weather, and she could see the lamplight from the window reflected in his dark eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight, for introducing me to him." "Thank you for coming," he said. A pause that held everything, the cold air sharp between them. "Chester," she said. "Adelaide," he said. She looked at him with the full force of those green eyes, all the guards down, or at least down enough that he could see through them, to the woman who was very much not frightened precisely, but was standing at the edge of something and choosing deliberately to step off it. "I think," she said carefully, "that I may have been alone so long that I have forgotten how to not be." "I know," he said softly. "I am not asking you to do it all at once." "You are very patient," she said. "It must be exhausting." "Not even slightly," he said. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she leaned forward and kissed him, briefly and with the directness that characterized everything she did, her cold lips warm at the center, and when she stepped back her chin was up but her eyes were bright, and she said, "Good night, Chester Shelby," and went inside. He stood at the gate for a while in the cold, looking at the house his hands had made sound, with the particular expression of a man who has received something he did not allow himself to expect, and who is accordingly more pleased by it than he could have predicted. He walked back to Mrs. Henley's with his hands in his pockets and his heart considerably larger than it had been an hour ago. December passed in a new key, warmer than its weather suggested. Chester and Adelaide moved around each other in the way of people who have acknowledged something significant and are now figuring out what it means in practical terms. She was not a woman given to effusion or performance, and the acknowledgement between them was less about grand statements and more about the small daily evidences that were the actual language of the life they were building toward. He brought her coffee in the mornings when he came to work on the foundation leveling, which he had started at last with the proper equipment borrowed from Holt's ranch. She brought him lunch at the corral, when she knew he was working with the horses and had forgotten to eat. He fixed the separating window frames one afternoon while she was at the school, so they were done when she returned without her having watched the work and felt indebted by the watching. She kept a pot of coffee on all day and never made a point of who it was for. James left on the third day after the dinner, and on his way out of town he shook Chester's hand on the street and said, quietly enough that no one else could hear, "She is remarkable, Chester. Do not let her get away." Chester said he had no intention of it. James nodded with the satisfaction of a man who has delivered his verdict and considers it complete. Chester asked Adelaide to take a walk with him on a Sunday afternoon in late December, when the day was cold and clear, and the panhandle sky was the particular enormous blue that made you understand why people came here and stayed. They walked south of town to a low rise of ground where you could see for 20 miles in every direction, which was Chester's favorite spot in the entire area, and which he had been meaning to show her for a while. They stood on the rise in the cold wind and looked out at the immensity of Texas spread around them, and Adelaide's hair was coming loose from its braid the way it always did, and her cheeks were pink from the cold, and Chester thought she looked exactly like herself, which was the best way anyone could look. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "You are serious," she observed. "I am sometimes serious," he said. She turned to face him, her back to the view, facing him with the directness she always brought to serious things. "All right." He took a breath of cold air. "I want to ask if you would be willing to consider the possibility of marrying me," he said. "And I want to say it that way, with the possibility, because I am not asking you to say yes right now. I am asking whether the idea is something you would consider, because if it is, I would like to court you properly, and if it is not, I would rather know now than later." Adelaide was very still. The wind moved her loose hair. She looked at him with the green eyes that saw everything precisely, and he met her gaze and held it, because Chester Shelby did not look away from things that mattered. "That is a very careful way to ask," she said. "You are a very careful person," he said. "I am trying to match you." Something moved through her face that was so complicated and so genuine that he felt it in his own chest. She was a woman who had been alone for a long time and had made it mean something, had made the aloneness into a strength so thorough that giving it up felt like giving something up rather than gaining something. He understood this completely. He waited. "Ask me properly," she said quietly. "Not the careful way. The real way." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring that had been his mother's, a simple band of gold with a small garnet, which was all his mother had ever worn, and which James had brought to him in December because Chester had written to ask for it. And the asking of it in the letter had been the first thing that told James everything he needed to know about the situation. He did not go to one knee because Adelaide Rourke was not a woman who needed theater, but he held the ring in his palm and looked at her and said, "Adelaide, I love you. I want to spend my life in your company in whatever way you will have me. Will you marry me?" The wind was cold and the sky was enormous, and the land stretched out in every direction, and Adelaide Rourke stood on that rise and looked at Chester Shelby, and the ring that was simple and real and meant something, and she said, "Yes." She said it without hesitation, the way she did everything once she had decided, and when he put the ring on her finger she looked at it for a long moment and then looked at him and said, "I want you to know that I am not marrying you because of the roof." "I never thought you were," he said, "or the hens, I know, or the accounting work," she said, "which I know came partly from you, though you have never said so." He looked at her. "Clancy mentioned offhand that you had recommended me," she said, with the expression of a woman who has known something for a while and chosen to wait for the right moment. "And Whitfield told me eventually that your observation at the town meeting prompted him to think of me. I am not angry," she added quickly. "I want you to understand that. I am not angry because you did not offer me anything. You simply moved information to where it could do its work, and then my own capabilities did the rest." He looked at her. "You knew, for about a month," she said, "and you did not say anything." "I was deciding how I felt about it," she said. "I concluded that it was the most respectful thing anyone had ever done for me, because it assumed I was capable without needing to say so." She paused. "You found a way to give without calling it giving." "I found a way to make sure what was already yours could be used," he said. She looked at the ring again. "My father used to say that the measure of a person is not what they take but what they make possible for others," she said. "He would have liked you, Chester." He took her hand, the one with the ring, and held it in both of his. "I intend to make sure he would not have regretted that opinion," he said. They were married in the spring, on a Saturday in April 1883, in the small white church at the north end of Main Street, which had a minister who had come down from Amarillo, and who performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man with a long circuit and a short afternoon. James came from Kansas City and stood beside Chester. Mrs. Henley and Maria from the restaurant sat in the front pew, and Clancy and his wife, and Gus the farrier, and Whitfield and his wife, and a good portion of Dusty Creek, who had followed the development of this particular arrangement, with the warm proprietary interest that small towns take in the romances that happen within them. Adelaide wore her mother's cream silk dress, which she had preserved carefully in a cedar chest for 20 years without knowing exactly what she was preserving it for, and her hair was up for once, with small white wildflowers in it that Chester had been responsible for, having gotten up before dawn to find them on the rise south of town. She walked down the aisle with her back straight and her chin level and her green eyes bright, and she looked at Chester when she reached him with the full force of that direct gaze and the smile that she kept for real things, and he thought that, Whatever he had done right in his life to arrive at this exact moment was not going to be enough to account for the luck of it. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at Maria's restaurant, which had closed for the afternoon to accommodate it, and there was good food and the wine from San Antonio, and a surprising amount of dancing given the size of the space. James danced with Mrs. Henley and then with Maria, and managed to charm everyone in the room, which Chester said later was just his brother being professionally smooth, and Adelaide said was simply James being James, which was a distinction she had arrived at over the December visit and had maintained since. They spent their wedding night in Adelaide's house, which was Chester's house now too, though the deed remained in Adelaide's name because she had told him before the wedding that she wanted to keep the deed that way, because her father's name was on the original, and she was not yet ready to take it off, and Chester had said that was exactly as it should be and had meant it, and that was that. They had been married for 3 weeks when Chester received a horse trading opportunity from a rancher named Dunmore in the next county, a significant deal involving 20 horses, and Adelaide spent the evening reviewing the terms with him at the kitchen table, her ledger mind as precise with his business as with anyone else's, and they concluded together that it was a good deal and should be taken. She did this not as a favor, but as the natural activity of someone whose skills were useful, and who was now in a partnership where those skills had a context. Chester let her do it without offering gratitude, because that was how they worked, and she let him handle the negotiation without wanting to observe it, because that was how they worked, and the horse deal was successful, and the money it generated went into a joint account at the bank that Adelaide had opened under both their names with the same neat efficiency she brought to all financial matters. By summer, the horse trading operation had grown enough to require a proper facility, and Chester began building a barn and small paddock on a piece of land he purchased at the south end of town, and Adelaide supervised the accounting for the construction with the focus she brought to everything. And they were both so busy and so well matched in their busyness that Chester sometimes stopped in the middle of work to simply look at her and feel the specific satisfaction of a life that is exactly what it should be. In August, Adelaide told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, with the direct factual manner she used for all significant information, watching his face as she said it to see what it showed. What it showed was that Chester Shelby crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her cheek, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and laughed, which was not what she had expected, and she said, "What is funny?" And he said, "Nothing is funny. I am just so pleased that this is the only way I know how to show it right now." And she sat down across from him with the smile that was only for real things, the private one, and said, "Well, that is a problem I can accommodate." He wrote to James that afternoon, and James wrote back within the week with a letter that was 3 pages long, which was entirely unlike James's usual correspondence, and which contained an embarrassing amount of enthusiasm that Chester read to Adelaide in the evenings in installments, doing justice to each piece of James's excitement, and Adelaide laughed each time, and said that James was going to be an absolute menace to the child in the best possible way. The baby arrived in March 1884, in the same bedroom where Adelaide had slept since she was 20 and come home to care for her father, which now had better window frames and a properly leveled floor, and a patch of wallpaper on the eastern wall that Chester had found in a shop in Amarillo and brought home on a whim because it had small green leaves on it and he thought she would like it. She had liked it. The baby was a boy, healthy and loud, with Adelaide's green eyes already hinting in his dark infant gaze, and Chester's broad frame already evident in the solidity of him. They named him William, after Adelaide's father and Chester's uncle, which satisfied both halves of the thing and which the baby seemed to have no objection to. James came down from Kansas City in April, ostensibly for business in Amarillo, actually to meet his nephew, and he held William with the surprised delight of a man who has not spent much time with infants and finds the experience considerably more compelling than expected. He told Chester privately that he envied him, which was the most personal thing James had said to Chester since their father's funeral, and Chester received it the way it was meant. "You could come south," Chester said. "There is real legal work here. The territory is developing." James looked out at Dusty Creek from the porch where they sat in the April evening. "It is very quiet," he said. "It has its moments," Chester said. James looked at the house, at the new barn visible at the south end of town, at the sound roof under the sunset sky. "You are happy," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have never been this happy in my life," Chester said. "Not even close." James nodded slowly. "That is worth a great deal," he said. "More than I can account for," Chester agreed. William grew in the way that babies in the Texas panhandle grow, which is to say with stubborn vitality and considerable volume, and Adelaide managed motherhood with the same precise capability she brought to everything else, though she was also, Chester noticed with a private tenderness, more unguarded with the baby than she had ever been with anything, in the way that even the most careful people sometimes are with their children. He was not jealous of this openness. He was glad of it. He had always thought that what Adelaide needed was something safe enough to be unguarded with, and he worked, every day, to make sure she felt that way about him too. By the fall of 1884, the horse operation was solid enough that Chester hired a hand, a young man of 19 named Owen, who came from a family of 8 south of the Canadian River, and who was hardworking and honest and slightly terrified of Adelaide's precise financial observations, which she directed at him during his first pay discussion, with the focused clarity of someone who wants him to understand that the numbers are not negotiable. Owen survived this introduction and became a reliable fixture of the operation, and Chester eventually gave him a share of the enterprise, not as charity, but as a practical acknowledgement that good people should have reasons to stay, which was a principle he had arrived at through personal experience. In the spring of 1885, Adelaide discovered that a family named Garrett, who had come into the area from Kansas the previous fall, had 3 children of school age who were not attending school because the family could not afford the incidentals, the pencils and paper, and the small fees that added up to enough of a barrier to keep children out. She went to Whitfield about it directly, and when Whitfield told her that the board had no provision for supplementing families in that situation, she went to Clancy, and then to Maria, and she organized within 2 weeks a small informal fund among the town's better-established businesses that covered the costs for the Garrett children without any fanfare or ceremony. And the 3 children showed up at school the following Monday, and Adelaide taught them that afternoon with the same attention she brought to all her students. Chester knew about this because Mrs. Henley told him, because Mrs. Henley knew everything that happened in Dusty Creek, but he did not mention it to Adelaide, only observed that she had seemed particularly satisfied with her week and did not probe the reason. She told him about it eventually herself, one evening after William was asleep, and she did it the way she told him most important things, directly and without performance, and she said, "I know what it is to need something and be unable to accept it as it is offered. I wanted to make it something they could accept." Chester looked at her across their kitchen table, the lamplight between them, the sound of William breathing in the next room, the new roof solid overhead, the whole weight of the life they had built together sitting around them like something that had been there all along and only needed the right 2 people to show up and inhabit it. "You are the best person I know," he said. She looked at him with those green eyes, and the guard was down, all the way down, which it had been for a long time now, and she said, "Do not be ridiculous. I am a reasonable person who occasionally does practical things." "With great elegance," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Chester Shelby," she said, "you are still, after 2.5 years, the strangest man I have ever met." "You like it," he said. "I do," she said, without equivocation, and smiled at him with the smile that was only for real things, and he smiled back, and outside the window of the kitchen Adelaide Rourke's father had built in 1871, the Texas panhandle went about its eternal enormous business under a sky so full of stars it looked impossible. And inside, everything was entirely possible and entirely theirs. William celebrated his second birthday in March 1886 with a party that Adelaide organized in the practical style of everything she organized, meaning that it was efficient and well-fed, and attended by every child in the school and several of their parents. And Chester sat at the edge of it all, and watched his wife move through the gathering with that brisk, warm competence that was entirely her own, talking to everyone and managing the food, and making sure the Garrett children had exactly the same plate as everyone else. And William toddled after her with the determination of a child who has identified his favorite person and intends to remain in proximity. By the summer of 1886, Adelaide was expecting again, and this time she told Chester while they were working side by side in the garden, both of them on their knees in the dirt, and he sat back on his heels and looked at her, and she looked at him, and they both laughed at exactly the same moment, which was not planned, and which was one of those small moments that are larger than they look. Their second child was a girl, born in February 1887, small and fierce and immediately convinced of her own opinion about everything, which Chester said was obviously inherited from her mother and Adelaide said was obviously inherited from her father, and William, who was nearly 3, was initially displeased, and then became the child's most devoted defender, which was a development that pleased Chester enormously. They named her Clara for no specific sentimental reason, only because it suited her, and it did. James came again that spring and took one look at the expanded household and said, with genuine warmth, that Chester had achieved something that no amount of legal cleverness could manufacture, which was a life that felt genuinely right in every dimension. He stayed 2 weeks, which was longer than any previous visit, and during those 2 weeks he spent several evenings with Maria from the restaurant, who was a sharp-eyed widow of 40 who had strong opinions about the law as she had encountered it in her life, and James found this collision of perspectives to be the most stimulating conversation he had had in years. Chester noticed this and said nothing. Adelaide noticed it and said to Chester privately, "Your brother and Maria are going to make each other either very happy or very argumentative." And Chester said, "With James, those are the same thing." And Adelaide smiled and said she hoped it worked out. It did, in fact, though that was a separate story. Chester finished the Eastern addition to the house in the fall of 1887. The 12 feet he had envisioned that first winter when he had looked around Adelaide's kitchen and thought about what could be done with the space. The addition gave them a proper parlor, which meant the kitchen could return to being only a kitchen, and William had a room of his own, and the house that William Rourke Sr. had built in 1871 was both its original self and considerably more, which was exactly as it should be. Adelaide walked through the completed addition on the October afternoon Chester finished it, running her hand along the new window frame, looking at the ceiling, feeling the floor under her feet, and she turned to Chester in the doorway and said, "It is exactly right." "I measured it 3 times, he said. "You always do," she said. "Someone taught me the importance of a thorough assessment," he said. She looked at him with those green eyes and the full private smile and said, "I think that person owed you a debt of gratitude." "I think," he said, walking toward her, "the accounting has been more than square for quite some time." She laughed, and the sound of it went through the new rooms and the old ones, through the house her father had built and the additions of their life together. And William came running from wherever he had been playing because he had learned that when his mother laughed like that something interesting was usually happening. And Clara made her imperious small noises from the bedroom, and the October light came through the new windows and lay across the floor in long golden bars. And Chester took Adelaide's hand in both of his, the way he had on that rise in December 3 years ago, and she held it the way she held everything that mattered, with the careful certainty of a woman who knows the value of what she has. "I want to say something," he said. "You are serious," she observed for the second time in their shared history. "I am sometimes serious," he said for the second time also, and she recognized the echo and her eyes were warm with it. "All right," she said as she had before. "I want to say that I know what you gave up," he said quietly. "The aloneness, the certainty of it, the safety of it. I know it was not nothing to give up. And I want you to know that I understand that, and that I have never for a single day taken it as something small." Adelaide looked at him for a long moment, and the house was around them, their children's voices threading through it, the panhandle sky enormous and indifferent outside the window, and everything she had built and kept and fought for alive in every board and beam and window frame. "I did not give it up," she said at last, softly. "I traded it for something better." He pressed his lips to her forehead, her temple, and she put her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and true, the way it had always been when she paid attention. "I love you, Adelaide," he said. "I love you, Chester," she said, "even when you are reckless." "I am only reckless with things that matter," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." Outside, the endless Texas sky went on, holding everything and everyone under its enormous blue indifference. But inside the house that William Rourke had built and Chester Shelby had repaired, and both of them had expanded into something they could not have imagined alone, there was nothing indifferent at all. There was warmth and noise and two children, and two people who had found each other at the intersection of stubbornness and patience, and a caved-in roof, and who had built something from those unlikely materials that was as solid as the ridge beam, and as permanent as the garnet ring on Adelaide's finger, and as improbable and inevitable as love has always been. In every year of every century that people have been finding each other on the difficult roads of this world and deciding, against all the careful evidence of their experience, to stay, they stayed. They were very happy. The roof never leaked again.